A whole civilization will die tonight. Words I never thought I would hear from an American president. And though Donald Trump thankfully didn't follow through this time, these words are a stark reminder of how reckless, immoral, and completely outside the bounds of international law this president is. Regrettably, he is no friend of the United Kingdom. He's no leader of the free world. He is a dangerous and corrupt gangster, and that is how we must treat him.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. That was Edward Davey, a member of British Parliament, calling Donald Trump, quote, reckless, immoral, dangerous, and a corrupt gangster. And in fairness, check, and check. They are valid criticisms of Donald Trump for sure. But more urgent than his frame of mind this afternoon is his state of mind, as people all around the country and around the world are now publicly beginning to ask the question, is Trump okay? Is he all there? Hold your nose and consider just the last 10 days of his presidency, strictly through the prism of his own social media outputs. On Easter Sunday, of all days, he urged the, quote, crazy bastards in Iran to open the bleeping strait, adding praise be to Allah. 2 days later, in genocidal fashion, he asserted, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, end quote, as you just heard recounted in the halls of British Parliament, a sharp contrast to what he shared a few days later, a now deleted AI image of himself as Jesus. That was just the opener of an all-nighter of social media activity that any other figure in any other industry would have seen, followed by days of coverage about their mental state. 9:50 p.m. post, a post at 10:10 p.m., a post at 12:43 a.m., a post at 2:35 a.m., less than 2 hours later, still awake, another post at 4:10 a.m., and many, many in between. Donald Trump interspersed posts about major foreign policy matters and commentary about foreign policy with commentary about other stuff, like Trump Tower on the moon. Today, after insisting that he thought that the Jesus image was an image of him not as Jesus, but as a doctor, he posted this, a photo of him getting a hug from Jesus. So we're back to Jesus, after Jesus, Dr. Jesus, if you're keeping track at home. Make no mistake, by virtue of his position as President of the United States, Donald Trump is right now the most powerful person on the planet. So evaluations of his state of mind and the tone, tenor, and temperament of his public outputs are essential, not just for those of us here, but for people who consider themselves his political patrons and supporters. They're mad too, and some of them have raged over Trump's blasphemy, the, quote, demonic influences they're observing. Others appear to be more either in denial or understanding, but they too are concerned about the pattern nonetheless. Watch that.
Overall, he's a good person, but he's turned into a mean old man, whether it's dementia or whatever it is, and he just screams at everybody.
As you get older, technology does pass you by. Maybe he did think it was Jesus. I'm not saying he didn't. I don't know the man. I didn't text him. But there's also a possibility he's just old. There's just a possibility he's just old.
Now, I don't know what the bigger picture is here. Maybe it's just an old man with an ego. But Donald Trump, I think this one for me kind of crosses the line.
So we're now at the he's just old phase of the Trump presidency and era. Okay. Our friend Tom Nichols puts it like this in The Atlantic, quote, this is not the behavior of a stable, healthy leader. Pope Leo, for his part, said he has, quote, no fear of the administration and will continue to preach the messages of the gospel. The rest of us, however, should be very worried about a commander-in-chief who is trying to govern the country between social media binges, who attacks religious leaders in narcissistic frenzy, and who imagines himself as a deity. If an elderly parent did such things, most people would be concerned. The president doing such things is far more alarming. The American people must not look away, as they have done so often in the past. They must pay attention to the president's deterioration and insist that the House and Senate start acting and functioning like branches of government by asking the White House to explain what is happening without insults or evasions before the eyes of the country and the world. That is where we begin the hour. Former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama now a co-host of Pod Save the World. Contributor Ben Rhodes joins us. Also joining us, senior contributing editor Michelle Norris is here, and Molly Jong-Fast is still with us. Ben Rhodes, this is not just our problem, but we seem uniquely incapable of dealing with it. Your thoughts about the inability of Trump's own allies to speak the truth about how he acts, and frankly, I'll put myself in the category of American media to sort of, to borrow a Trump behavior, stare at the sun and cover this consistently.
Yeah, I'll start with the second part here, because when you listen to that British member of parliament, I think what it highlights is that's obvious. What he is saying is obvious. And he's speaking in a moral language. He's not just speaking about a policy issue. He's talking about a feeling that we all have in our guts, that we know intuitively that he is behaving in an unhinged way. And it's moved not just into social media feuds, it's moved into war and peace. It's moved into the use of violence. It's used into the threat. It's moved into the threat of the destruction of a civilization. And I think that's the kind of language that people feel has been missing from the Democratic Party at times, where it feels like a normal policy difference when this is not normal, or a media that feels like it has to kind of sane wash what Trump is doing so that they're presenting the information to viewers or readers in ways that are familiar. But what is happening is not familiar. And then with the Republicans, I think what you see them beginning to reckon with is, let's not forget, that whole media infrastructure on the right spent years doing this to Joe Biden, with some credence, right? And I think the Democratic Party kind of came around to the notion that, yeah, maybe we do need to step in here when Joe Biden was running for re-election. But the reality is we still have 2.5 years plus on the clock with Trump. And so if the guardrails don't go up right now from Congress, I mean, putting aside removal, that's going to be very, obviously, it's a fanciful conversation in a way to have before the midterm election. But the reality is he's acting with freedom of action because he's not facing any kind of pushback or guardrails from a Republican-controlled Congress. And those guardrails have to be put in place immediately because we are in an emergency moment here. And that's what I think all institutions in this country, the media, and you're increasingly seeing foreign leaders stepping up to do it too. There need to be guardrails around his behavior.
Ben Rhodes, let me play a little bit more of Ed Davey, British member of parliament.
Trump's latest cunning plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. That will only escalate this crisis and jeopardize the precarious ceasefire. So it's right that the UK is not joining Trump. And I welcome the Prime Minister convening a summit to offer an alternative to Trump's. We must work with our reliable allies in Europe and the Commonwealth and our partners in the Gulf to bring this conflict to an end and keep open the Strait of Hormuz. That is critical for tackling the cost of living crisis that is getting worse and worse.
The off-ramp that he's offering there, if you listen closely, is an economic calamity. And I keep wondering if it is the economic calamity that will ultimately be the pretext, because you're right. And I will tell you this, even in newsrooms, talk of the 25th Amendment can be discouraged because people say, oh, it'll never happen. Look who's in the cabinet. Right? Or impeachment. It'll never happen. Look at the Republicans. But it is one of those things that won't happen until it does, because it must. And I wonder if you think that sort of frame around economic calamity might be, the path through which we get there.
I think so, because Trump has approached this war in Iran like a social media fight with somebody, when in fact, it's not just the real lives that are at stake on the ground. This has been a calamity for the entire global economy. There are multiple countries around the world that have significant fuel shortages. The cost of living is going up everywhere, including here in the United States. And that's when political leaders start to pay attention. And Nicole, I think it does come down to fear. Trump, when he came in, he capitalized on fear. That's how universities and law firms and other American institutions capitulated to him. But the reality is, out of political necessity and survival, the fear is breaking. Now, the Pope has his own moral authority to say that he's not afraid of Donald Trump, but neither, increasingly, are these other world leaders. Mark Carney just won significant elections in Canada running ferociously against Donald Trump. Giorgia Meloni, the right-wing populist leader of Italy, just got into a fight with Trump and stood up to him. That's someone who came to his inauguration, right? And I think what you're getting at is the fear factor is breaking. The sense that Donald Trump, we have to capitulate to him, or we have to at least charm him or be nice to him because we're afraid of him. I can tell you, Nicole, that is gone internationally, because it is more dangerous to placate Trump than it is to stand up to him. And that's the dynamic that if and when, and I think it will shift in the United States, including in the Republican Party, because the political survival of Republicans is at stake here, too. When their constituents are paying $5, $6 a gallon for gas, when the fear breaks, right, that's it. Like, it doesn't come back. And I think Trump is teetering on the edge of that kind of dynamic, and it's going to take that fear breaking for people to stand up to him. And when they do, it could be in a herd.
Absolutely, because if we know anything about the DNA of the Republican Party, it's that they're cowards. And so when one goes, they will all go, because then they'll be afraid of being on the wrong side of that political tide. Because you mentioned Prime Minister Carney, let me show you some of what he had to say.
At this decisive moment, Canadians are demonstrating just how strong we are. You know, it started quietly. People choosing a wine from the Okanagan over one from California. Anyone had any bourbon recently? No. Sorry. A family planning a vacation to Prince Edward Island instead of booking flights to Florida. Small individual acts of solidarity, but repeated millions of times. And together, they make a statement. We are the masters of our destiny.